Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here today to tell you a little bit about my research, but also to share with you a little bit about how I got into this and how I found myself doing this kind of research. And so I want to give you a little bit of backstory and a little bit of conversation about how these projects fit together. So first, this is exactly right. I largely teach quantitative methods, statistics, and that is a pretty strange thing for me personally because I went to school and I was very convinced that I was not a math person. I had very gendered experiences of math classes growing up, so I really didn't do any math, and I couldn't see what math had to do with the things that I cared about, like social justice, education, social stratification. Those connections were never made for me. But when I went to college, I found that the kinds of articles in my sociology undergraduate that I wanted to be reading were full of statistics, and I was really frustrated that I couldn't read them. And so that's ultimately what I did. I went to grad school to learn more about statistics, and then I fell in love with it and really changed my own personal narrative about whether or not I am a math person. Now it's basically all I do all the time. But it's also a personal passion of mine to try to show others that this thing that I think sometimes we tell ourselves we can't do for whatever reason is actually totally attainable. If I could do it, anybody can do it. And here I am today. I found this really strong connection between math and these social justice issues that I want to tell you a little bit about in my research. So that's a little bit of my background. I'm going to tell you about one project of mine in particular. I'm also going to touch on another one, but I also want to invite you to ask questions throughout. I saw a couple of questions in advance from the readings. Those questions were great, and I would love to touch on those as well, so feel free to bring up anything that comes up that might be connected between these two. So that's the plan for today. Let's see here. So just to get started, in general, my research area is pretty broad. I focus on educational programs, policies, and practices that shape differential outcomes for kids, basically. That's really broad. As I've already mentioned, I have a real interest in strong quantitative methods. So as you probably know, statistics in particular can be used for good or for evil. You can basically make them look like whatever you want, and that's dangerous, but it's also a real challenge to learn how to use statistics responsibly and to try and produce really high quality research that we can trust, that tells us whether the programs and policies and interventions that we're trying are actually having the desired effects, and also whether they are having unintended consequences. So those are the things that I kind of worry about methodologically. And then I describe myself as focusing on three, what I call potential pivot points. So areas that I think are real, like big levers to change the trajectory of kids' lives. And so those three levers are basically being in school itself. And so one of the really interesting things about education policy is that I think we don't know the answer to this question. Do schools help or hurt inequality? Does it make inequality worse, our schooling system, or does it make it better? And that's crazy to me that we don't know the answer to that fundamental question. And there's also a lot of research out there that says that schools just don't matter that much, that the opportunities and outcomes that we have are shaped before we get to school. And so that has been a real area of focus for me, is really trying to pull that together. Like how do we make sense of the role of schools in inequality? And I've done that in two primary ways. One is to look at what happens when kids are not in school compared to when they are in school. And so that is the connection to some of my summer learning loss research, where we basically see that you probably know that when kids come into school, there's already a wide spread of their outcomes on day one, and that by the time they finish school, they end up in even more broad, disparate places. But what I find in my research is that the vast majority of that separation is happening during the summers when school is not in session. And so that's a really different view on the role that schools play in the production of inequality. So there's that, and then related to that, I think of summers as like one of the main places that we need to look to understand where inequality is arising. The second one is the one that I'm going to talk about a little bit today or mostly today in my presentation, which is early childhood education. I already mentioned that some of the inequalities that we see are largely there on day one of kindergarten. And so we know that a lot of what shapes kids' outcomes happens early. And so thinking about the inequality in access to childcare and preschool and things like that is also, to me, a really strong lever for changing kids' outcomes. Like change the place that they start, change the foundation from which they grow. So summers, early childhood education, and then the third one for me is basically access to great teachers. And this one's pretty intuitive. You probably have all had experiences with teachers on both sides, teachers that might have really changed the way that you developed, and also you've probably had some teachers that you felt like did not help so much. And so thinking about how impactful the assignment to specific teachers is pretty much a central focus of my research. And so learning all about what we call the teacher labor market, but just basically the strength of the teacher workforce and inequitable access to highly effective teachers. So how do we get the teachers who are those life-changing teachers to the kids who need them most? What policies, programs, and practices can we put in place to make that happen? And unfortunately, most of the time, why do our policies fail to make that happen? So those are kind of my areas. Briefly, the reading on ProComp that you did really falls into that third bucket. ProComp is a pay-for-performance policy. It's a policy that is intended to help strengthen the teacher workforce by giving teachers who are particularly effective or working in particularly challenging situations an incentive to keep doing that work and to stay in Denver in this particular case. So that's the idea of that policy. It's a complicated policy, but it is part of a larger body of work that I've been doing in Denver. I just recently came from CU Boulder, and now I'm here at UVA. And so I have this research practice partnership with Denver, and it's called the Teacher Workforce Collaborative. I just want to tell you a little bit about it because I think it says something about the way that as an education professor, as a policy professor, I think about approaching my work in a way that feels meaningful to me. Because on a day-to-day basis, what I do is I crunch numbers on a computer, I look at a big administrative data sets, I tackle these statistical analyses. It can feel a little far away from what I told you I care about, which is, equitable opportunities for kids, what shapes the lives of teachers, whether they feel like they can be sustained in their jobs or not. Sometimes my day-to-day feels a little far away from that. So the way that I have tackled that in my own work is to have an ongoing research practice partnership with a specific district. Okay? So the way that this research practice partnership works is that we have a long-term, ongoing work scope with Denver, and instead of just saying like, okay, you're going to pay somebody to evaluate the causal effects of ProComp and then write a report and move on, we say instead, let's tackle a topic together. And all the things that come up for y'all on a day-to-day basis, Denver, tell us about it. And we will do what we can to help. And so this helps me in a lot of different ways. It helps me stay current. It helps me know that the work that I'm doing matters to somebody in real time. And it also gives us a real gut check on the feasibility and reality of the kind of work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. So we have this vision for sustained collaboration. Our mission is very broad intentionally. It's to really focus on shaping and supporting a highly effective teacher workforce. So that could mean a ton of different things, actually, and that's the point. So our research practice partnership focuses on all things that are related to recruitment, retention, knowing who is an effective teacher, which obviously is a really hard, hot button, but important thing to be able to do. To think about where we place teachers, so that's really related to the access issue, right? And also teacher compensation, so how do we compensate and reward teachers for the excellent work that they do? And also how do we create opportunities for teachers to grow in their career by becoming leaders and feeling sustained, like there's a career trajectory in being a teacher. So those are some of the many things that we focus on. And so I just wanted to give you that context so you could think a little bit about how me as an academic has connections to some of the topics that you might actually care about yourselves, and how I try to bring those connections into my own work. Any questions about that? Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so today what I'm actually going to talk to you about is a randomized control trial of an intervention that I've been doing in Westminster Public Schools, which is a school district in Colorado that's been ongoing. And I'm going to tell you quite a bit about it. I'm going to really focus more on kind of the origin story and kind of what makes this study awesome and like what we have done in terms of findings. I'm going to try and really kind of highlight how this is emblematic of my intention to keep my work connected to what's actually going on in the field. So let me tell you a little bit about why I think this is an important thing to study. Well, there are actually decades of research that say that access to high quality early childhood education experiences have large and lasting impacts on kids' lives. Like, they have done studies that follow kids into their 40s and look at their salaries and their propensity to go to prison and all these kinds of things. And all of those things can be affected by a high quality early childhood education experience when you're very, very young. There aren't a lot of things that we know in education that have those kinds of long and lasting benefits, but ECE is one. So it's that part of the reason I think of it as like a high leverage pivot point for kids. And then more recently, early childhood education, I was just talking about its benefits for the kids, but I think the pandemic has made us realize that ECE childcare is actually really important to us as society, right? So for families, especially working families with young children, having access to particularly free or low-cost childcare is what makes those families' lives work. It makes them be able to go back to school or to take on a job, to make ends meet, is to have access to affordable childcare. And so that is another big piece of this. It's not just about benefits for the kids, but also about how adults shape their lives, particularly those who are dual working or single parent families, okay? So I think with that context, I think we're really interested in trying to put together policies and programs of effective early childhood education experiences. And actually, this has been a major focus of the Biden administration, though it's been a little bit of a rocky policy process. For a moment there with Build Back Better, it looked like the proposal was going to be basically to add an additional year of school to public education. Like, instead of starting at 5 years, we're going to start at 4, basically, for all kids throughout the US. Now, that didn't happen, but that is the idea, I think, is trying to extend this kind of support for families. So this is kind of the context of this work, is some real interest in this really potentially strong foundational intervention. However, I would say that the more recent research on early childhood education policies has poked at these findings a little bit and has called into question whether all ECE experiences have these positive and lasting benefits. And so there's some early research coming out that the benefits are actually a little bit more variable than we thought. And more problematically, a lot of the studies to date, except the one that I was mentioning that follows kids until they're in their 40s, basically they look at kids as they go through an early childhood education experience, and it sees that they have positive effects at the end of pre-K or the beginning of kindergarten, and they said, cool, it has good effects, let's move forward, let's fund this thing. But then they started following kids through school, and some of those effects dissipate. They fade out by the time kids are in 5th grade. And even more recently, there was a very controversial large-scale study in Tennessee where a program of universal pre-K access had positive effects for the first couple of years. And then in about 3rd grade, the results started showing some null effects. And then by 6th grade, it was showing negative effects. So the provision of this universal pre-K seemed to have actually harmed students. So it actually turns out that we're pretty far away from knowing what about an ECE experience can actually lead to these long and lasting benefits. We know it can happen, but we don't know how to design that policy exactly. And so there was this big consensus statement, even before that study came out, that said essentially that we have a black box problem. We know that this can work, but we need to know the specific structural features that we should say, especially as the federal government gets into this, okay, when you design state X, Virginia, your ECE offerings, these are the things it should have, okay? And so we need what they called like a full dashboard of research to think about all the different things. Is it a longer day, 16 kids, 12 kids? Should they take a nap in the middle of the day? You know, all these kinds of things about design of these different kinds of programs. And so that's what this project is all about. It's being part of that full dashboard of research. Now, the study is going to randomly assign children and their families to an offer of full-day pre-K, which didn't exist in this district before, versus half-day pre-K, which was the standard practice in this district before. Now, my experience is that when I start talking about this study, most people say, I think we already know the answer to this question. But after that, people tell me 2 different things. So that suggests to me that we do not know the answer to this question, but they either tell me, obviously, having more of pre-K would be better, right? Because it's just a dosage, an additional dosage of an educational experience is clearly better, okay? The other thing I hear is that, obviously, a full day of pre-K for a 3 or 4-year-old is not developmentally appropriate, and it would be better for kids to be at home with their families. And so they say the opposite. And then there's also a kind of in the middle argument, which is like, maybe this is better to have this full day pre-K, but it's so expensive that it would be a bad use of resources because we could use that money to do some other policy. And so why is it so expensive? Well, basically, you are serving half as many kids with the same number of classrooms, buildings, and teachers. And those are the things that make education expensive: space and human capital and teachers. So it doubles, basically, the cost of education. So it could be that it has some positive effects, but it's just not worth the money. So those are all things that I think lead us to really be interested in this question, plus it's just super practical. As you probably have noticed, that's kind of a theme in my research. I really want to make sure that I'm asking questions that I could say to almost anybody, hey, like, does this question make sense to you? Should we know the answer to this question? And most people would say, yeah, that seems like a good thing to know. And so this feels like something that all school districts are going to need to face at some point. Should I be offering full or half-day pre-K? Okay. The other thing is that obviously it's something that we can implement. You know, there are lots of things that I think in education we think might be beneficial, but we are not good at scaling them. Some program that is like precious and has huge effects when there are 12 kids in it whose families were the first adopters, but then when we try and roll it out to 50 schools or something, it doesn't work anymore. But this is not that way. You can just implement this structurally and it will scale. So it'll be expensive, but it will scale. And the other thing that I like about it is it has the potential to be a win-win-win. And so that's great politically because it means there are lots of folks who will be interested in the benefits of this, which means that there's a wide source of political support. So it can be good for kids themselves. It can be good for the parents as well, right? All parents would like to have access to some support for their kids. And it's also good economically for all of us to have a stronger, a better educated, workforce, which is another argument you can make for this. So I think that makes it really potentially beneficial. Okay, that's the backstory. The backstory is that how did I get involved in this? Kind of interestingly, somebody from this school district, Westminster Public Schools, they emailed me at CU Boulder, just like this, they emailed me. And that's how you email. And they said, hey, we have this thing that we want to try. We want to do it, but we want to make sure that once we try it for a couple of years, we know whether we should keep going or not. I said, cool, that sounds awesome. I would love to be the independent evaluator of that. Sign me up. And then later they said, you know, we actually emailed 30 academics, and you're the only one who responded to the email, which I just think is fascinating. I think that speaks to some of the disconnect that we sometimes have between academia and the real-world needs of policymakers. And so I found that amazing, because this has become such a huge and important piece of my own research, and I'm really grateful that they reached out. Okay, so that's the background. Let me tell you a little bit about Westminster as a place. It's a small district near Denver. I mentioned that. It serves about 10,000 students a year. It's labeled here as Adams County District 50. They changed the name because they have all these different Adams counties here, and it was very confusing. So this is a district that is largely free and reduced price lunch eligible, so that's lower economic disadvantage. And it is predominantly, the term they use is Hispanic in their data, Latinx, and it is 34% designated English language learners. And in this particular case, we have 9 school sites that have these preschool classrooms. So this also is a population that I really care about, right? There's actually also some research that suggests that, this is not that surprising, that the benefits of early childhood education are particularly strong for non-white and low-income students. So that's exactly who this population is, and so I feel very fortunate to be working in a context that matters so much to me. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about what was going on in Westminster before I got started. Westminster, like many places, was offering half-day, partial week pre-K. And just to say this really clearly, I'm not talking about kindergarten here, I'm talking about pre-K. So this is predominantly 4-year-olds for this program, okay? And so they had 3 hours a day, 4 days a week. And so kids either went to the AM session, right, from 8 to 11, or they went to a PM session from 12 to 3. Okay, but the teachers taught all day because they would teach an AM and then they would teach a PM session. So they are used to teaching a full day, okay? And they would have, it's state mandated that you have 16 kids in every classroom, okay? Yeah. Yes, it is free of cost. So this is public education in this particular case, and so it is free of cost. Some of these models have, even in public education, do have sliding scales or pay for services, but this is free cost. Thanks. But the district had a problem. It knew how many kids lived in its district, and they knew that only about half of their kids were in that district were coming to Westminster's public system for pre-K. And so they basically felt that mismatch. And obviously they want to serve as many kids as possible, and so they asked themselves, they asked families, like, what's the problem here? But I think it's kind of obvious. Like, imagine that you are a working family and your kid goes to school from 12 to 3 p.m. Like, what kind of job allows you to do that? Not a whole bunch. And so that was their hypothesis. It's that the half-day schedule was just really problematic for families where both parents worked or where you had a single parent. This is just like a non-starter. And the 12 to 3 is particularly hard, but 8 to 11 isn't great either. So that was their hypothesis, and they had a certain amount of money from a particular source to try to pilot some full-day classrooms. They didn't have enough to serve all their kids. They knew that, and so they needed a fair way to say, like, hey, we don't have a lot of this resource. We know it's going to be popular. How are we going to fairly decide who gets it? And that's why there's an opportunity here to do a randomization, a lottery. They basically said, hey, if you're interested, sign up, and then we know how many slots we have that we can pay for, that we can afford, which was basically, depending on the year, 7 or 9 classrooms. Each classroom, I told you, has 16 slots in it, so that's how many slots they had. And they would just take all the people who applied and randomly offer kids either the full day spot or their business as usual, which is half day. So they were always going to get what had been offered in the past, at least a spot in half day, but some of them got an offer of full day in this case. And it's really worth noting that full day is a game changer, right? So it's 7 hours a day for kids, 5 days a week. And so it's more than doubling the amount of school these kids get in a year. So it is a really important year in a kid's life, and it's a really different educational experience. And so that's important to know here. This is like, the way I think about this is like, this is a big treatment contrast. And so I would be hoping to see some meaningfully large effects from this. Questions? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so every classroom, AM, PM, and full day, they have to have 16 kids in the class. That creates lots of different complications. One of them is actually, even before full day happened, they have to figure out exactly how many teachers they need every single year, and that's a little bit of a dance. And they did have to hire a few new teachers as part of this opening up a whole bunch of new classrooms. So they definitely had to hire new teachers. However, they did not, this is super important, I don't know if this is where your mind was going, they did not just hire a bunch of new teachers and then put those teachers in the full day classes, right? Because then you'd have all of your novice teachers in full day. And so they basically distributed teachers, not randomly exactly, but we can like look at how they assigned teachers, and we don't see big differences in the full versus half day teachers' experiences or anything, or credentials or things like that. Great question. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. How many families were interested? And actually, we didn't know what was going to happen. When I talk about this study, I talk a lot about the things I would wake up in the middle of the night and worry about. And one of them was like nobody was going to apply to the study, and then the whole thing would fall apart. But the first year we had, well, let me just say one other thing. The other thing was like we knew we couldn't control the percent of kids that got offered full day because it had to be exactly 16 kids and exactly the number of classes they had. So like, for example, if just 2 extra kids applied to those full day classrooms, I had to randomly assign 2 to not get it, and that just wouldn't work. You couldn't do the study anymore. So I didn't have control over that percentage, but it turned out in the 3 years that we did the study, we got exactly 50% randomized to full and half day, off by 1 or 2 students. And that was pure luck. And part of it was because from one year to the next, the number of applicants increased. So in the first year, we had about 220 applicants for 112 slots. They saw that there was more interest, so they opened up a couple more classrooms in the second year. And then we had about 270 in the second year, and then we had about 315 in the third year. So it grew and grew and grew, which the district liked. Yeah. So why the 16 students just keep the correct ratio? Yeah, that's right. So usually there's state mandates about how many kids need to be in a classroom per teacher. These ratios are often mandated. Good question. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they did actually consider that. It's an interesting, and actually that might be even more relevant to us now that we've been through COVID and we've seen all the crazy schedules that schools can put together for kids. And then ultimately they actually talked to families and they said, actually, like that's not gonna help. That's not gonna ultimately solve this problem. Like I have a 9-to-5 work schedule. And so either one is still a problem for me. But it's a really creative thinking. So I appreciate that. Yeah. absolutely. So let me talk about that a little bit. I feel like you're planted because that's where I'm going next. Okay. So I think I have said all of this. Basically, I've mentioned some of the things about the teachers, that they work the same schedule, that they have the same number of kids in each classroom. They were using the same curriculum in the different classrooms, so you don't have to worry about like, oh, maybe it wasn't the curriculum, or maybe it wasn't the full day, it was some difference in curriculum. No, not some difference in the teachers. It is worth knowing just briefly that some things were mandated to be added once they had full day for kids this age. That was that now they needed to feed them more because they were there for longer, and that they also mandated that the kids had to take a nap. Now, when I heard that, I was like, great, this is going to have no effect because it's just like you're just adding on a nap and a meal. And so this is not some huge improvement in their educational experiences. But we will see that that is not what has happened so far, and I'll tell you more about that. But to get to your question, and then I will grab yours, let me say a little bit about the process. So the step one was that families applied to the study, generally in January through July. They express interest. We know that there's more interest than we could serve. They complete a consent process. And then we do this child level randomization. Actually, we randomize twins together, so we don't end up with kids in the same family going to different schools or something like that. And then we have them tell us, what is your first choice school site? Because we wanted families to not get assigned to a school that they couldn't go to. And so we then actually randomize inside each first choice school site. So it's actually like if we had 7 schools, this is what we had in the first year. It's like we have 7 little experiments, okay? And so we randomize 16 of each of those, right, to get the treatment condition, which is full day. And that percentage varied a little bit from class to school to school, and actually from year to year. It ended up being on average 50%, which was so lucky. And then after we randomize, right, there's the 50%, parents decide, okay? So parents are always able to decide what to do with these offers. So they can choose to say, okay, I needed full day, and so now I got half day and I'm out, okay? And that happened, and we didn't know how much it was going to happen, but it did. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And actually, the full-day families could do that as well, though they did not very often because they were excited about getting this full day offered. But what made it work for us is that regardless of what they did, we continued to have them as part of the study. And so what we get to do is we get to say, what is the causal effect of getting an offer of full versus half-day pre-K, okay? And that's going to include even kids who ended up not going to Westminster because we we met up with them at libraries on nights and weekends and conducted the same assessments that we did in the Westminster schools, we also did with those kids as well. So that's how we avoid some of the bias problem that you are talking about, because that's the big problem with randomized control trials. I mean, actually, all quantitative methods, when you're trying to estimate causal effects, have this correlation is not causation bias problem that you're bringing up. RCTs are the best for this, but they can still get undermined by uneven attrition, which is what you're talking about here. So the idea that actually families would be more likely to leave the control group than they were to leave the treatment group. But we solved that by trying to keep them in. So that's sort of my answer to your question. Does that clarify? Cool. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so curriculum vary in terms of how specific they are. And the one that they use, it's called Little Treasures. It's free. It doesn't have a lot of evidence of being particularly effective, and it's pretty broad. So they're like, here's some topics that you should be covering in week 7, 8, and 9. And so they could spend more time on that or less time on that. It wasn't very prescriptive. The teachers could also, they had a lot of freedom. So they could have also said, you know what, we're going to use all the extra time for play. Or they could say, we're going to use all the extra time for math, right? They could do kind of whatever they wanted, even inside these pretty loose curricula. So that's the answer to your question. Okay, so what do you think pre-K would potentially have effects on? We wanted to not just think about kind of the obvious things, but we wanted to do a bunch of outcomes. And so we looked at a couple of different measures that are pretty standard across a lot of studies. One is the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, PPVT. This is the percent of kids we were able to assess ultimately, because some of the kids, we tried to keep track of them, but they moved away, they did a bunch of things. So we did pretty well, 89%. But it's a measure of children's receptive vocabulary in English. Okay, that's important for this population, right? But we also did something that's called the ESIR, which is a developmental screener, because there's also this idea that if you could have a more intensive experience in early childhood in that first year of education, that you might actually be able to do one of two things with your special needs. One is to actually avoid the need for it altogether by starting out on a more solid foundation. Okay, so the avoidance of a need for special needs provisions of certain types, obviously. And the other is actually because they spend so much more time with their teacher, double the amount of time, that actually you could avoid what is a known problem with special education, which is inappropriate designation. So there's a lot of research that says that young boys, particularly boys of color, get inappropriate special education designations at this age. And the idea is basically that that is built on some stereotypes, and that a more intensive relationship between teachers and kids could actually avoid those inappropriate designations. So we wanted to also see about their developmental trajectory as well. So we measured that both at the beginning and at the end of the school year. And then we also used some exploratory outcomes that really run the gamut: cognition, language, literacy, math, physical development, and also socio-emotional development. And later on, do I have this? I don't have it on this slide, but we had a lot of folks saying, you know, even if this doesn't have an effect on kids' math and reading, if they are more socially, emotionally prepared, then if they have higher executive function, for example, then that's enough for this to be worth it, even if it's not coming out on the traditional academic outcomes. And so we added an executive function test that's called head, toes, knees, shoulders, which is intentionally out of order and is actually quite hard to do. And this is a side story, but we tested the kids at the beginning of the school year and the end of the school year. And at the beginning of the school year, it was so interesting. They could not do this task at all. It was just too hard, because they'd say, like, put your hands on your shoulders, and then I'm gonna say head, but when I say head, touch your toes. Like, it's kind of that kind of holding information in your head, and they just couldn't do it when they were at the beginning of the year. And then a bunch of them could do it at the end of the year. It was so cool. It really showed you what an important time in these kids' lives are, because they change so much in about 9 months. Okay, so that's all the stuff that we looked at. We did a couple of other things. Those are those individual student assessments. We also observed the classrooms 3 or 4 times a year. We videotaped them. We used a rubric to rate the quality of student-teacher interactions. We recorded how time was getting used minute by minute. We also surveyed parents and teachers as well, because we wanted to know it all. Like, we wanted to know if this was having academic impacts. We wanted to know if the kids were more socially developed. We wanted to know if they were avoiding special education designations, but we also wanted to know if their parents were going back to school sooner, or if they were saving money on childcare, or if mom was less stressed. So we had psychological measures related to maternal stress on our surveys, and we really wanted to understand if this was working and through what mechanism it was having benefits. So that was really the motivation behind it. For the sake of time, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and tell you a little bit about the results. So these are estimated results, impacts on being assigned to full versus half-day pre-K. And I have these numbers here. These are in test scores and they're in standard deviations, but I've translated them here. This is more interesting, I think. So in essence, what you can see is that they are statistically significant differences in the treatment versus control group. In all these different models, these are the PPVT skills. This is the special needs developmental screener. They're all positive. Full day was better. They're all statistically significant. Those are the stars. And they can translate into about an additional 1.2 to 1.6 additional months of learning in the pre-K year, or On the ESIR designation, they get these scores, but they are ultimately translated into decisions of like, does this kid need to be rescreened, or does this kid need to get referred for special services? And so it changed the percentage of kids that were designated as okay, not needing to be rescreened, by 6 to 8 percentage points. Okay, so this was having meaningful effects, both on those, and then here are a bunch of other outcomes: cognition, language, literacy, math, physical development, social, emotional, all positive, all except for one statistically significant. And this test is called the TS Gold. And the percentage of students who are meeting benchmarks for kindergarten readiness on these increased in the full day setting by 5 to 13 percentage points. So really pretty large effects. In general, there's kind of some rules of thumb in education about what like a large effect is, and they tend to be around, just loosely speaking, 0.15 to 0.25. And so you can see that that's about where this is. These are actually quite large effects. Now, they're quite large effects for quite expensive things, so you have to keep that in mind, but we were excited to see that this was having so many positive effects. And actually, here are a couple of other ECE intervention studies. So, you know, I was showing you numbers that are like 0.2, 0.3, things like that, 0.4. Here are some of the other, this is like the effect of Head Start for kids, 0.09, 0.18. Here's one of those negative ones that we've seen. So this is quite a large effect relative to a lot of other research out there. What happened during the school day? Remember that we observed classrooms? I think you might have some ideas about how this extra time was spent. So just before I show you the results of our observed time use, you kind of imagine what you might expect is going on with those extra about 3 hours. Okay, and then I'm going to show you. Like, is it that they doubled math and ELA time? Did they just sleep more? What did they do? Here are the results. Basically, the answer is they did, in fact, add that nap. And they did spend quite a bit more time eating. I told you they had to do that, so that's not surprising. But in essence, what you'll see here, these colors are the different activities, so they basically just scaled up everything by a little bit. So they just took the day and just made it, added a little bit more of everything, and that's how they leveraged the extra time in this district. So some of these differences might seem small, but they add up to a lot of extra time on some of these things. So this helps us have some insight into like, okay, it's now time to start talking to other districts about whether they should do this kind of thing. How should they use the extra time? Well, we have a little bit of ability to talk about how this time was used in this district. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. I want to tell you just a little bit about some of the other things we're doing. So full versus half-day pre-K, we've looked at some academic outcomes, the end of pre-K PPVT, the TS Gold. We're interested in developmental outcomes like that ESIR that I told you. We've looked at that, but we're going to look at a few other things too. I'm not going to tell you about it today, but I'm going to just tell you what's on the agenda for us. So I mentioned the HT, the heads, toes, knees, shoulders. I can barely do it. We added that for the reasons that I mentioned. And we're also going to look at family structural outcomes and home activities. But in addition to that, we are going to look at longer term outcomes. Right? I told you about that kind of troubling study where they saw some positive effects actually reverse. So that's what I worry about. That's what keeps me up at night now, is that our effects are going to reverse. And this is about, the kids are in like 3rd or 4th grade now, so it's right about the time that that should start happening. So that is nerve-wracking. But in addition to that, we're also going to continue to look at their probability of having a special education designation. In grades K and 1, we actually are seeing some evidence that there's a 5 percentage point decrease in the probability that kids in the full day setting actually have special education designations. That's huge, right? It's a big deal to not be getting special education designations as long as they are actually, you're not getting them and you didn't need them. So that's big both for kids but also for districts, because special education designations are one of the most expensive things that they do. And so having kids have inappropriate special education designations is policy-wise a really big problem for districts. Okay? And we're also looking at family outcomes. So I mentioned we're looking at parental work, how many hours families are able to work, childcare costs, the number of childcare arrangements that families are having to use to cover the workday. So we see in a lot of the families that it's like, I have a babysitter, and then I go to private care for a couple of days, and then we do a couple of hours of the half day, and then the grandma takes care. Like, it's just a mess, right? And so we see a reduction in the number of different arrangements that families have to use to cover the 9-to-5 workday. And so we also see some increases in the percentage of household adults that are employed, decreases in hours of paid non-WPS childcare, so the other things that they have to pay for to cover the workday. We see an increase in regular napping, which makes a lot of sense, but actually we have some evidence to suggest that actually it's regulating kids' sleep cycles in a way that affects when they go to sleep and when they wake up, and maybe some small decreases in parental stress as well. And as I have mentioned, the last thing I will say is the next thing on the agenda is fade out. And this has gotten harder and harder to do because as the kids move through school, we worry about losing track of them. Like, we were really good at it at the beginning of the study, and now over time, they're moving away and doing things, and lots of reasons that it's hard to track kids that I'm happy to talk about. But that's it. I mean, that's a lot, I know. These are big questions, is really thinking about whether these long-term effects have persisted or perhaps reversed. And I'm just really excited about this work, and I hope it shows you kind of what's possible in ed policy research. So thanks for your time.